Prophet grew, as did her desire to see his followers destroyed. She was not a woman known for yielding to failure, and every setback only fueled her determination to crush the movement. Despite the severe hardships, the Muslims began to see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. The Prophet Muhammad's message continued to reach the hearts of more and more people, even in the face of relentless opposition. New converts were joining the ranks, and the pressure that Jamil had hoped to inflict on them was not having the desired effect. Rather than breaking their spirits, the cruelty they suffered seemed to strengthen their resolve. It was in the midst of this growing strength that the Quraysh, led by the likes of Jamil and her husband Abū Lahab, found themselves at a crossroads. Their strategy of isolation and persecution was beginning to backfire. The Muslims were surviving, and their message was spreading beyond the borders of Mecca. Even the staunchest enemies of Islam could not deny the growing strength of the movement. Jamil's tactics of using her wealth to isolate the Muslims were beginning to lose their grip. The Quraysh were starting to feel the effects of the growing influence of Islam, and they knew that they had to take more drastic measures if they hoped to stop it. But in her heart, Jamil could not accept the reality that her efforts had been in vain. She could not fathom a world where the Prophet Muhammad's message might triumph over the ancient traditions and power structures that she and her tribe had fought so hard to preserve. It was during this time of increasing tension that a significant event occurred, one that would alter the course of history and force Jamil to confront the undeniable truth of what was happening. The Muslims, under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad, began to gain a foothold in the region. The messages of peace, unity, and equality were spreading far and wide, and the old tribal divisions that had held Mecca in a stranglehold for centuries were starting to break down. Jamil, ever the skeptic, could not ignore this shift. The once feared resistance of the Quraysh was crumbling in the face of the Prophet's message, and the influence she had wielded for so many years was beginning to fade. The realization that she could not stop the tide of Islam began to sink in. She, like many others, had underestimated the power of faith, the strength of unity, and the resilience of the human spirit. But even in the face of this growing realization, Jamil could not abandon her cause. Her hatred for the Prophet Muhammad had become deeply personal, and her sense of loyalty to her tribe and her husband remained unwavering. She could not allow herself to acknowledge that the world was changing in ways she could no longer control. She continued to fight with everything she had, using whatever resources were at her disposal to hinder the spread of Islam. Despite her best efforts, the tide had turned irreversibly in favor of the Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad's message had reached the hearts of many, and the support for Islam had grown exponentially. The very thing that Jamil feared most was happening before her eyes. Islam was becoming a force that could not be defeated by wealth, power, or cruelty. The final blow to Jamil's efforts came when the Quraysh realized that their attempts to stop Islam by force had failed. The Muslims were not to be crushed by fear or violence. Instead, their faith had endured and even flourished under persecution. The Prophet Muhammad's message had transcended the boundaries of Mecca, and its influence was now reaching out to other tribes and regions. The battle between the Quraysh and the Muslims would eventually culminate in the conquest of Mecca, a turning point in the history of Islam. As the Prophet Muhammad and his followers entered the city in triumph, Jamil found herself on the losing side of history. Her life, once filled with power and influence, was now overshadowed by the success of the very cause she had spent so many years fighting against. But even in defeat, Jamil's legacy as a powerful woman of the Quraysh would remain. She had fought fiercely to protect the traditions of her tribe and her way of life, but in doing so, she had inadvertently played a significant role in the rise of Islam. Her actions, though driven by hatred and opposition, had shaped the early days of the Muslim community and had ensured that their struggle would be remembered for generations to come. The last stand in the legacy of Jamil. The days following the fall of Mecca brought about a profound shift in the world Jamil had known for so long. The city that had once been the stronghold of the Quraysh, where wealth, power, and influence were measured by the strength of one's tribe, was now in the hands of the Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad, the very man she had opposed for so long, had returned to Mecca victorious, and the tables had turned in a way that no one, not even Jamil, could have predicted. Jamil, in her final moments of resistance, had to watch as the very people she had despised took control of the city. The forces that she had fought so hard to stop were now the ones shaping the future of Mecca and beyond. Despite the crushing defeat, Jamil's resilience never wavered. Her spirit was not easily broken, and she refused to bow to the overwhelming presence of the Muslims in the city she once controlled. In the face of this monumental shift, Jamil's role in the opposition to Islam remained a poignant part of the story of Mecca's transformation. Her relentless hatred for the Prophet Muhammad and his followers had been a defining feature of her life, but now she had to confront the reality that her efforts had ultimately been in vain. The rise of Islam could not be stopped by wealth, power, or influence. The faith that she had tried so hard to suppress was now the faith of the city, and its message was spreading further and further. As the Prophet Muhammad entered Mecca, his message of forgiveness and reconciliation resonated deeply with many who had once opposed him. For those who had fought against Islam, there was now a chance for redemption, a chance to reconcile with the faith they had once rejected. But for Jamil, there was no such opportunity. Her heart was hardened by years of opposition, and she could not bring herself to accept the new reality. The loss was too great, and the grief of seeing her world crumble under the weight of Islam's success was something she could not bear. Despite the collapse of her power, Jamil's legacy as one of the most feared women in Islamic history remained. Her actions, though driven by hatred, had played a significant role in shaping the early days of Islam. She had been a key figure in the opposition, a symbol of the forces that sought to crush the new faith. But in the end, her efforts had been futile. Islam had triumphed, and the Prophet Muhammad's message had prevailed. The legacy of Jamil was complex. She had been a woman of immense power and influence, one who used her wealth and status to shape the fate of Mecca. Her cruelty was legendary, and her opposition to Islam was unyielding. Yet, despite all her efforts, she was ultimately on the wrong side of history. The story of her life became a testament to the power of faith, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unrelenting march of time. As the Muslims began to establish themselves in Mecca, Jamil's name continued to echo through the streets of the city. She was a woman who had been both feared and despised, a woman whose actions had left a lasting mark on the early history of Islam. But as the years passed, her role in the story of the rise of Islam would be seen not as one of victory, but of defeat. Jamil's final moments were marked by a profound sense of loss. She had fought for so long to protect her way of life, to maintain the power of her tribe, but in the end, all of it was lost. The very cause she had devoted her life to had been overthrown, and the world she had known had been forever changed. Islam had become the dominant force in Mecca, and Jamil's resistance had only served to delay the inevitable. Yet, despite her failure to stop the rise of Islam, Jamil's legacy was not entirely one of bitterness. Her role in the history of the early Muslims was crucial, as it demonstrated the strength and determination of those who fought against them. Her actions, though misguided, were a part of the larger story of the struggle between the old world and the new, a struggle that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. In the end, Jamil's life serves as a reminder of the complexities of power and influence. She was a woman who held the world in her hands, but in the end, She could not stop the forces of change that were sweeping across the land. Her story, though one of opposition and defeat, is also one of strength, resilience, and the unwavering determination to hold on to what she believed in, no matter the cost. The rise of Jamil in the heart of Mecca. Jamil's name carried a weight that could shake the very foundations of the city. Known for her strength, power, and fierce loyalty to her family, she became one of the most feared women in Islamic history. To understand why she left such an impact, one must first understand the world she was born into. A world where power was held by the wealthy and the influential, and women had little say in matters of society, politics, and religion. Yet, Jamil rose above the limitations placed on her by society to become a force that no one could ignore. Jamil was born into the Makhzum tribe, one of the most respected and influential tribes in Mecca. Her father was a respected man within the tribe, and her lineage alone commanded respect from those around her. She was not just any woman, but a woman of high social standing. Her marriage to Abū Lahab, one of the wealthiest men in Mecca, further solidified her position at the top of the social hierarchy. Abū Lahab, like his wife, had a deep animosity towards the Prophet Muhammad and the message of Islam. His hatred for the Prophet was so intense that he openly mocked him, attempting to spread lies and falsehoods about him. But it was Jamil who took her husband's hatred a step further. She did not just oppose Muhammad through words. She became an active participant in the persecution of the Prophet's followers. Unlike her husband, who was often blunt in his attacks, Jamil was subtle in her actions. She used her position within the society to influence others. Her wealth and high status allowed her to sway many within the Makkah elite, and she used this influence to spread lies about the Prophet. She would gather people together, whispering words of hatred about Muhammad, planting seeds of distrust and fear in their hearts. This made her a dangerous adversary to the early Muslims. Her actions were not just limited to words. Jamil's wealth allowed her to fund the campaigns that were designed to discredit the Prophet and crush the nascent Muslim community. She would sponsor those who worked to sabotage the Muslims, providing them with the resources they needed to continue their efforts. This made her one of the central figures in the opposition against Islam, and her cruelty became notorious in Mecca. The Muslims, however, did not break under the weight of her attacks. They stood firm in their beliefs, even as the persecution intensified. But Jamil did not back down. Her hatred for the Prophet and his followers only grew stronger, and she used every tool at her disposal to ensure their failure. The more the Muslims endured, the more determined she became to bring them to their knees. Her most famous action was her involvement in the boycott of the Muslims. At the time, the Quraysh tribe, which was the ruling tribe of Mecca, decided to impose a total boycott on the Muslims. This meant that no one would trade with them, marry them, or offer them any form of assistance. The boycott lasted for years, and during this time, Jamil used her wealth to ensure that the Muslims suffered. She used her resources to reinforce the boycott, making sure that the Muslims would be isolated from the rest of society. But despite all of her efforts, the Muslims did not falter. They found strength in their faith and in each other, and they held fast to their beliefs. Their resilience was a testament to their determination to follow the Prophet Muhammad, no matter the cost. The more Jamil tried to break them, the more they grew stronger in their resolve. But even the strongest of individuals are not immune to the tides of fate. The rise of Islam could not be stopped. The Prophet Muhammad's message continued to spread, and the influence of Jamil began to wane. Her wealth and power, though formidable, could not stop the inevitable. She, like so many others who had fought against the Prophet, would eventually see the fruits of her labor turn to dust. Her legacy, however, would not be forgotten. Despite her efforts to destroy Islam, Jamil would be remembered as one of the most formidable women to oppose the Prophet. Her strength, intelligence, and influence would become a part of the history that shaped the early days of Islam, and, though her actions were born out of hatred, they played a significant role in the story of the rise of Islam, a story that would change the world forever. The struggle and the challenge as the years passed. Jamil's animosity toward the Prophet Muhammad only deepened. The power she once enjoyed, built on her wealth and influence, now became the foundation of her relentless pursuit to extinguish the message of Islam. Her life became consumed with one singular goal: to break the will of the Muslims and crush their faith. However, the more she fought, the more the Muslims held firm to their beliefs, and the more her reputation as a ruthless woman grew. Jamil's opposition to the Prophet was not confined to her personal animus. She saw the rise of Islam as a direct threat to her family's status and the traditions of her tribe. The Quraysh had long been the rulers of Mecca, and the Prophet Muhammad's teachings were shaking the very foundations of their control. The transformation that Islam promised could not be allowed to happen in her eyes, for it would undo everything she had worked for and everything her family had built. Her relationship with her husband, Abū Lahab, remained one of shared hatred and ambition. Together, they launched an all-out campaign to discredit Muhammad and those who followed him. While Abū Lahab used his status to attack the Prophet publicly, Jamil's role was more subtle. She knew that the fight for the soul of Mecca was not one that could be won through brute force alone. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of the people, and she understood the power of influence as the Prophet Muhammad's message continued to spread. Jamil's actions became more calculated. She knew that her wealth and influence alone were not enough to stop Islam from growing. The Muslims were persistent, and every attempt to silence them only made them more determined. Her frustration grew as she realized that her efforts were not leading to the desired results. Jamil took it upon herself to make the lives of the Muslims even more difficult. She would sneak into the homes of the poor and oppressed Muslims, using her status to intimidate and threaten them. She would instruct her servants to harass those who had converted to Islam, spreading fear throughout the community. It became clear that Jamil was not only a woman of power but also one of cruelty. However, even her efforts to isolate the Muslims did not work. The early Muslims found solace in their faith and strength in each other. The more she tried to destroy their spirit, the more they seemed to rise above her tactics. Every attempt to hurt them only seemed to fuel their resilience. In this way, Jamil's actions, though intended to break them, only made the Muslim community stronger. Despite her ongoing war against Islam, there were moments when Jamil was forced to face the reality of her situation. She could see that the power of the Prophet Muhammad's message was growing beyond Mecca. It was spreading to other tribes, and even the Quraysh began to feel the pressure. The tension between the old way of life and the new was becoming impossible to ignore. One of the most pivotal moments in Jamil's life occurred during the early stages of the boycott. The Quraysh had decided to isolate the Muslims economically and socially, hoping that they would give up their faith under pressure. The Muslims were driven to the edge of starvation, and many were struggling to survive. It was during this time that Jamil used her vast wealth to ensure that the boycott would be fully enforced. She provided funds to ensure that those who supported Islam were ostracized completely. The Muslims were deprived of food, water, and basic necessities, and they were left to suffer in isolation. While the rest of the Quraysh were beginning to have doubts about the effectiveness of the boycott, Jamil remained resolute. She believed that this was the final test for the Muslims, and that their spirit would eventually break. But to her surprise, the Muslims, though weakened, did not falter. They gathered together in their homes, their faith growing stronger with each passing day. They prayed, supported each other, and held fast to their belief in the Prophet Muhammad. It was during this time that Jamil's role as a figure of fear and power became increasingly pronounced. Her actions, though driven by hatred, ensured that she was viewed as one of the most formidable women in Mecca. She was a woman who wielded power not just through her wealth, but through her ability to manipulate the people around her. Her enemies feared her, while her allies admired her. But the tide was turning. The very thing that Jamil had worked so hard to prevent was now becoming inevitable. The Muslims were surviving, and their message was spreading. Even though she continued her efforts to destroy them, the very thing she feared most was happening. The strength of Islam was unbreakable. Jamil's life would soon take a dramatic turn as the winds of fate began to shift. Her cruelty and determination had made her a powerful figure, but they would not be enough to stop the coming revolution. The story of Jamil, one of the most feared women in Islamic history, would soon meet its most unexpected chapter. The breaking point as the years dragged on. The battle between the Muslims and their oppressors became more intense. The persecution of the early Muslims continued unabated, but the Prophet Muhammad and his followers showed no sign of surrender. Their faith, though tested beyond measure, remained unshaken. Meanwhile, Jamil's hatred for the